Welcome to this session, which is roughly to do with how it all started in terms of modernism. And we are looking at the two parts of the subcontinent, their parallel and occasional stories in which there were convergences. I'm very pleased, an art historian, and she's a curator who specializes in contemporary South Asian art. She was a Stephen and Eleanor Hines Scholar at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where she did her PhD on Indian art and nationalism, and she's now associate lecturer over there. In 2018, she guest curated the much-needed exhibition on the progressive revolution, Modern Art for a New India at the Asia Society Museums in New York, and which focused really on the so-called Bombay Progressive Group, which is of great interest to us here in Lahore. And she's currently collaborating with Dr. Samina Iqbal, who is in a sense a counterpart in terms of her research studies, and because she compares Pakistani modern art with Indian modernism. And they're working together on a number of research projects. Samina is, I'm proud to say, one of my former students. She's a practicing artist, she's an art historian and an academic. And she got her BFA from the National College of Arts in Lahore, and she went on to the US and did her MFA from the University of Minnesota in 2003. She completed her PhD in art historical studies from the Virginia Commonwealth University and in Richmond. And she's, her interest really zeroed in on the group of avant-garde artists who were practicing in Lahore, and it was known as the Lahore Art Circle, something that I sort of grew up with myself, so I'm deeply interested in it. And this is a group that emerged after independence in 1947. She's currently working on extending her research by undertaking a comparative study of what modern art entailed for other neighboring countries around Pakistan, including the Manasa region. And she's doing a sort of parallel dialogue with the Western canon. Samina has taught studio arts both in Pakistan and in the US. She's been a teacher for the last 15 years. And she's currently working as assistant professor at the Lahore School of Economics. And Nour Aslam brings in a very critical component to this discussion, the component of the collector, and how the collector has really emerged as a patron and as a way of conducting conversations between the modernists far away from home. She's somebody who has just completed her master's degree at the Royal College of Art in curating contemporary art, and previously she was director of the external program, external relations for the Lahore Biennale, so she's a well-known figure here. And she was director of programs in August 2015, the critical time of preparing for the Biennale. She was the head of gallery development at Art 15, which is an international art fair based in London. And she was head of sales at Bonham's auction house in South Asian art. And she also specializes in Middle Eastern and Turkish art. During her 5 years at Bonham's, Nour actually put together sales in New York, London, and Dubai, and helped to raise the profile in terms of the collectors in the market. She studied at Sarah Lawrence College, but she's lived in many countries across the world thanks to her parents' peripatetic existence. We'll start really with Zehra first, and what we are hoping to do in this discussion is really form an idea of how modernism emerged, the relationships which were very delicate between the artists in these newly independent states, India and Pakistan, their relationships with the states, with the state, which was occasionally ambiguous, sometimes supportive. There were times of great celebration. There were also times of great rejection. And I hope in this conversation we'll be looking at these structures and how they affect the way in which artists trace their career, and subsequently, once they leave us, how we read their work in the context of our lives today and what it means to us. Their histories are of critical importance, I think, to the way artists, art lovers, the community at large, traces what are our ways and means of constructing our identities, and how the visual arts and their times and our times connect. So, Zehra, can I just ask you to start off?
Okay. Hello, can people hear me? Yes, I think it's okay. So yeah, you have to bear with me a little bit because my legs are short and I'm swinging in one direction, and this thing is doing its own thing. So basically, this panel comes out of conversations that Samina and I have been having for the last, I think, 2 to 3 years, which is sort of comparing the modern in India, particularly with the progressive artist group, which I'll show you a little bit about. With the Lahore Art Circle. And it's a similar point in the sort of late 40s, early 50s of post-independence. And the narratives we found on both sides of the border, as it were, sort of looks at them as fairly isolated entities doing very separate things. But as Samina and I have been putting our research together, we find that actually there are a huge number of parallels. So this very small little paper that I'm going to be giving you today, which then Samina will sort of take forward in terms of some of the issues to do with the Lahore Art Circle in Pakistan, and then Nour will bring both of these together by looking at, collectorship in a more general, broader South Asian modern. But so each will come into an idea of both the modern and the national in different ways, and that is perhaps something that we can discuss after we finish speaking. So a little bit of what I'm doing today is going to be slightly contentious, and I don't ever mind being fought with, so you don't have to agree with me. You can even, quite happily tell me I'm wrong. In fact, I'd like to be corrected, particularly at the elements that I know a little bit less about than some of you in the audience. And so yes, so now we're going to start, and I'm doing this swinging thing, so sorry. I'll come back to this image. It looks completely irrelevant, but we'll discover why it actually isn't. It's a miniature with Dara Shakur, the sort of emperor that never was. There's been two new books on him. One of them is actually extremely good. Apparently the other is less so. So Dara Shakur, who the emperor that never was, in conversation with Samad, the naked fakir. Okay, so I'm starting here a little bit with the Bombay Progressive Artist Group. So they were founded in 1947, late 1947, early 1948. So this is just after Indian independence, right? And they're known as kind of 6 big boys of the Indian art world, and they are all male. And so at least the initial group were all male. I correct that a little bit because there's another lot who joined them and they were not all male. one woman. Wow. So this is an image from the New York exhibition, and the reason it's here is so that you can see the blow up of the photograph that we had in the show. So as you walked into the exhibition in New York, so this show was about defining who this group really were, and sort of unpicking some of the myths and kind of critiquing some of the myths around them as well. So you'll see with the photograph, it's got 6 people in it. So the 3, and below the photograph, this is actually an installation shot, right? So we're actually hanging things at this point. So at the bottom there, okay, this doesn't work as a pointer, is a little painting, and that is 3 figures. That's Raza, Souza, and Ara. So out of the sort of big 6 were 3 who started the group, came together, and each one invited one. So in the end, you've got this mythology of the 6. And the 6 also include then Souza invites Hussein, who we'll be talking lots about, and Ara and Raza invite Gade and Bakre. Now we know a little bit less, they're a little bit less famous. Not that we know less about them, but they are less famous than the others. And so I'm now going to kind of take you on this very short, perhaps slightly contentious journey of looking at one of the perhaps most famous of the progressive artist group, and that is M.F. Hussein himself. And as we all know, Hussein is very much touted as the poster boy for the Nehruvian secular state, all the way until the 80s, when the Hindu right decides he is not all right. They start attacking him for presenting Hindu goddesses in the nude. This had never been a problem before, and I'll show you why. But suddenly it becomes a huge problem. And by 2006, for an image that I'm going to show you a clothed version of, he gets into real trouble, and finally he dies in exile in 2011. And part of what I'm sort of arguing here and going to talk to you about is the way in which Hussein both fits into the sort of secular national dialogue of India, and he is so vital to that, the development of that dialogue, as is the mythology of the progressive artist group. And this is because Hussein is Muslim, just as Raza, also in the group, is Muslim. And so they become poster boys for the notion of a secular India, an India that is syncretic. And at this point, the sort of Nehruvian secular narrative is, well, to be honest, kind of very much positioned against Pakistan, right? So it's like, India is not about religious identity, it is about a syncretic identity. And hence, both Raza and Hussein are so important for that dialogue, but particularly Hussein. And so I'm going to show you some of the images of Hussein which make him absolutely central to that very syncretic notion of a kind of Hindu-Muslim marriage in his work. And it's that very same marriage, I will argue, that then gets him into trouble with the Hindu right. So what you have here is 2 competing versions of identity, right? And they go into crisis with each other. So this is Raza made into a stamp. And I'm showing you this to show you that these are the 2 like sort of poster boys. And if Raza is made into a stamp, so is Hussein made into a stamp. And so this image has got like three images inserted within it. And what are the 3 images? So this is Hussein's Spider and the Lamp. Is possibly one of his most iconic works. And that is actually made into a stamp. And I just wanted to point out to you about this sort of Hindu-Muslim marriage, that the work that he is referencing, the sort of the Indian past, South Asian past that he is referencing, is very specifically always focused on this kind of syncretic dialogue. So, Hussein is not really looking at Mughal miniatures for his inspiration, but he is looking at Gupta sculpture and Bashali painting. And of course, as everybody knows, Bashali painting is sort of a subset of Pahari painting. And Pahari painting in itself is a kind of it's a segue from the Mughal style. And some people trace it to actually to Dara Shakur taking two painters up into the Pahari hills with him. And so it comes out of that kind of Mughal court tradition, but then it becomes a marriage with local Rajput traditions as well. And so I think it's really, really important to point out that this is what he is quoting in his building up of an iconography for the Indian modern. And just to show you, so this is the Peabody Essex, really, really famous, another iconic Hussein, perhaps the most iconic Hussein. And this is called Man. It's a 1951 work. It's currently going to be, the Peabody is doing this rehang, and so I can actually, I think, tell you that it's going to be on view again for the first time in very, very many years, and it's permanently going to be there so that people can go and visit it in Salem. A little bit far. So Hussein, let's decode this image, because I think that's kind of integral to my argument. Sorry, swinging thing happening again. So you have the hand in Man, so you know the hand that goes like that. So this hand is usually being identified as the hand of the craftsman. So it's sort of very symbolic, is that this is an artist, a bit like Rodin's figure, sort of dreaming about creativity. But what also is he creating is his concept of a new India. So the hand has often been compared to mirroring the hand that Le Corbusier puts in Chandigarh. And of course, Chandigarh, very importantly, Lahore is part of Pakistan. And so Nehru commissions Le Corbusier to build another capital for the Punjab, for the Indian Punjab. And that becomes Le Corbusier, right? That becomes Chandigarh. And so this hand is very much part of the kind of the creation of the new Indian modern. And Hussein's hand is often read as a reflection of that. But I'd also like to point out is that this hand, it could also be the sort of the hand of, of Tazia processions. And this is one way it's not often read, right? So often you do have, the acknowledgement that Hussein is Muslim, and that obviously feeds into the Hindu rights narrative as to why he can or cannot use certain imagery. But what you don't often have is looking at how that kind of, that sort of elements of Islamic culture actually come into the building up of the modern as well for him. Okay, going fast, and now coming to the point of it all. So we know that if he's an iconic artist and he has all of these various syncretic things happening in his work, why, and to the extent that he almost becomes a kind of sycophant to the Indian state. And this is particularly the case, and we get particularly annoyed in the Indian art world with the association that Hussein makes for himself with Indira Gandhi. During the emergency years, where she's at her most contentious, he is actually aligning himself with her, and he paints her as what? Mother India. And so there you have Mother India, and there she is, welcoming her image as Durga, as Mother India. However, the image on the right, a covered up version of the one he gets into trouble for in 2006. So it's a covered up version, and I found it on the net very recently because it was never there before. But so somebody obviously likes their Hussein and has copied the naked one and has put clothes on it. So I decided, well, maybe nakedness is not a good thing, like just tease your imagination a little bit and you can sort of imagine Mother India without any clothes. But my issue is actually, this was never used to be a problem in the 70s. It was never really a problem until the rise of the right. And this is the issue, is that with the Hindu right and Hindu nationalism also attaches. So just as the left and kind of Hussein's kind of syncretic secularism is very wedded to the idea of India as connected to this mother goddess, and the sort of contours of the nation fit into her body. So does the right have exactly that thing. It has the same affiliation, but of course their Mother India is a much more demure, fully clothed one. And what becomes a problem for them is the idea that a Muslim artist dares to present Mother India, the Hindu goddess, without any clothes. And so you have this kind of completely stupid random line, which I quite enjoy, and I actually found it from a hate site, that says, "Why didn't Hussein paint Allah in the nude?" This is, let's end it there. And then I'm just going to give you a last bit so that it segues into what Samina is going to do. And part of what I'm sort of arguing is that, if Hussein represents the fault lines and the cracks in the conception of the Indian state and the notion of the modern, and he sort of brings together all of these different elements and actually shows what can't quite be absorbed in that syncretic dialogue, i.e. his Muslimness or his Shianess, then in a similar way, and this is where you can fight with me, is I think that there are parallels to be drawn with Sadikin. Also because, Sadikin, similarly to Hussein, becomes a sort of popular artist. He also, by the 80s, and 70s and 80s, sort of represents the state in terms of calligraphic modernism and the development of the modern. But he also, and most people forget this, by 1976, a bomb is dropped on his exhibition because he's also seen as a heretic. And it's particularly for images like this, which identify him with the naked fakir or samad, and I'm going to end there. But I think that that's something that Samina and I kind of want to push a little bit and see if Sadikin also points to the fault lines of the Pakistani modern.
Thank you. So Samina, while all this is going on in India, 48 onwards, we have in this city the germination of modernism with artists who are, each one of them is an individual, very interesting trajectories they have. And you've been really looking at very closely about at how this happened and where they drew their strengths and how did the Lahore Art Circle become really of interest to you?
So I'm going to pick up where Zehra dropped, but I think I'm going to touch upon Sadkian really towards the end, because Sadkian was not part of the Lahore Art Circle. He was definitely part of Lahore Art Scene, but not part of the Lahore Art Circle. So I first want to address three issues that I really look at is the modern, the national, and then the complexity of identities, which actually stems from this idea of modern and the national. And what I would try to argue is that, this formation of Lahore Art Circle, which I would talk about in 1 second. Previously, Zehra and I have collaborated and in detail talked about how the formation happened, but this time only taking one of the figures of Ahmed Pervez as one of the artists from Lahore Art Circle. Just a little context, really 2-3 lines on Lahore Art Circle, which was founded in 1952 with the arrival of Shakir Ali in Lahore, joining Mayo School of Arts, and then, so these are the people who really make up, these are the founders of Lahore Art Circle, then many more joined in later. But then after 1958, it started to disintegrate, the core founding members started to move to Britain and, other places in the world. I want to go back for 1 second on this idea of modernism and then, talking about nationalism. So, for one of the things that Zehra and I have been collaborating and, contesting is how the identities are really complex and how they develop according to the circumstances and things that really shape up those things. So on one hand, we're looking at Bombay Progressives coming together as a group of artists, 6 group in India in 1947, the year of partition, which is really kind of looking at the this group as a formation promoting secular India, because, we have just been divided, it's been cut off, it's a kind of a denouncement that, look, you have separated, but, we are a secular country. So all 6 members come from different religious groups like Muslim, Hindu, and even the low caste Christians and Buddhist as well. right? Dalit as well, right? But for Lahore Art Circle, what happens is the member of the group comes together as a force to really kind of introduce a new kind of art, rather than really claiming that nationalist agenda in that sense. Having claimed that, I would come back to it when I talk about Pakistan Group London, which happens in like 1956 in London. So like, going back to the idea and claiming that Pakistani identity in foreign land is something that is very intriguing, and I want to look at that. So just quickly looking at Ahmed Pervez as one of the figures through which we are going to look at the complexities of modernism. So Ahmed Pervez is one of the most hot-headed, eccentric and dramatic artists who quintessentially really fulfills the idea or stereotype of a crazy artist, like, somebody who is just a very restless nature, goes place to place, never settles at one place, and then finally settles in Karachi. Ahmed Pervez was born in Rawalpindi. Quick biography data for him. Studied in Kashmir, then also in Gordon College, and then he takes up a job in Karachi as a clerk, and then he's totally bored out of it. He comes back to Lahore. He's trained under his uncle, who was Jacob Michael, and he got a training for 3 years working under him, learning academic style of painting, which he absolutely hated. And I just wanted to quote something from him, and I want to show you what was his work, earlier work, that looked like. And I quote, this is in Emmett Pervez's words: "The living stream of art was not far from his studio," and he's referring Michael, his uncle, his studio. It was flowing in the art books of the British Council Library. Since I could not afford any of the art publications, I would borrow these and deposit them with the tandoor wala, the owner of the roadside eating place where I used to lunch. The books were obviously safe, as the owner and his customers had neither the time nor the inclinations to make a study of modern art. Each day as I went for lunch, I would find some time to enjoy the adventures of modern art, the dictators and gentle rebels and all. The more I studied, the clearer I became that my very loving uncle, my only teacher, would not allow me to take a single breath of artistic freedom. He had his own interpretations of the classic art which he wished me to master. An art which was a mixture of commercial calligraphy and the well-known debunked art of the cinema hoardings. He's in fact set a pattern for an art tyranny that had not existed before me. The oval heads in 3/4 parts, the forehead, the nose, and the rest, and then, of course, each body equal to 8 heads remained or had to remain an amazing discovery. Side by side with the imperative oval, there existed some such that had to be mastered, the Roman, the Gothic, and the rest. And then I had to convert my ovals into faces, chickens, and daira noons. So you can just tell, like, he was, of course, not happy with the kind of training. So Shakir Ali comes as a fresh breath of air in Lahore, joining Mayo School of Art and forming this, he immediately connected with these young artists. So it included Sheikh Safdar Ali, who is well known in Lahore, more as a designer than a painter. And then we have Sayyid Ali Imam, Muin Najmi, Ahmed Pervez, Anwar Jalal Shamza. And then I also had 2 women artists, Razia Feroz and Maryam Habib. 2016, Mrs. Hashmi and I co-curated a show which was shown as part of Lahore, Fez Mela. And we actually showed the work of all of these artists. So what happens is, I gave you an example of what Ahmed Pervez looked like, his work looked like. It was very academic style. And then there is paradigm shift in his work after having these debates and continuous exchange of ideas with Shakir. So this is the kind of work he starts to produce after Lahore Art Circle Foundation. And then there is a shift again happening, and that what happened is that, Ahmed Pervez, Anwar Jalal Shamza, and then Sayyid Ali Imam. So you would see Anwar Jalal Shamza is on my right side, and Ahmed Pervez is second left on your, I think it's on the left, and Rani is Ahmed Pervez's wife, that, he goes on in London and gets married, and he lives there for 9 years. And so what happens is, while living in London, these were the most difficult years for Ahmed Pervez, because this is a time when disappointment comes his way. Nobody acknowledges him. So when he leaves Pakistan in 1955, he's pretty much acknowledged here. He had shown his work all around Pakistan, in Lahore, Karachi, and Rawalpindi, definitely in Murray with USIS. And then what happens is when he comes to London, nobody wants to acknowledge his work, so he's really disappointed. And this is one of the vignette that people talk about is like, his, so the cold London becoming literally cold for him, and for him to take his canvases, rip them apart, put them around his neck, and walking up and down the streets of London, because this is how crazy he was. I mean, he was just literally disappointed that nobody acknowledged his work. This is a time where they, as a group, they come together. Sorry, and I just want to show you, and they form another group which is called as Pakistan Group London. So it's three of them, Ali Imam, Emmett Pervez, Anwar Jalal Shamsa, and they join hands with Safiuddin Ahmed and then also Murtaza Bashir from East Pakistan. And so this group comes into being. And what happens for this group is like, they actually have formulated a manifesto which said, the aim for the formation of the group is to introduce Pakistani contemporary artists in the West and to provide them opportunities and projections. The manifesto above seems to be a continuation of the earlier Lahore Art Circle one that, I have studied and kind of formulated. I haven't founded their manifesto for Lahore Art Circle. Finally, Ahmed Pervez gets recognition, so I go back and show you the works that he's producing while living in London. So again, a shift happens in his work, and these are the two examples that I just brought in to show you what happens to his work in London. And then after living in London, as he was about to started breaking into the scene, he's showing around, he again makes a switch to Pakistan. He moves back to Pakistan, lives in Karachi for 2 years, and then again goes back to the US. And he has shown like a one-person show. He has had a solo show in New York Gallery. It was called as International Gallery. And so lives there for another 2 years, come back to Karachi again. And then he lived there for 10 years till he died in 1979. This is his work from his time in Karachi. Sorry, let me just go back for 1 second. So these are just the two examples that I wanted to share. I just wanted to come back and touch upon what Zehra started talking about, Sadkan. So, one of the things that you said, you need to be corrected while we are. So Sadkan was much loved in Pakistan, and, being that figure, he never needed that kind of, accreditation from part of a group. But then also I feel like, at that time, this is people who have read about Ahmed Pervez, they would know in 1966, there was a newspaper article printed in the newspaper called The Leader, where Ahmed Pervez had actually, and the newspaper, this is the title of the newspaper, not my, Attack on Sadkan by Emmett Pervez. So what he's saying is that, he's looking at the series of Sadkan's painting, which were based on cobwebs. And what Ahmed Pervez claims is that, these webs are not webs, these are flowers. So the webs are only in your mind. And what happens is this just totally stirs a very hot conversation between other artists, and they come to defend Sadkan and say that he's a much better painter than Ahmed Pervez. So this is something that, so there is a critical dialogue that is happening at the same time. But just going back to the same idea of the complexities of identities, what I have tried to demonstrate is, so when Lahore Art Circle is formed, it is not out of the need to claim nationalism, but it is rather to find a new pathway for discovering new language for art. And then when they are moved to London and they form Pakistan Group of London, that is the time when they really want to be acknowledged as Pakistani painters. So that's my, thank you.
I think all of this gives us lots of food of thought, and we must acknowledge that it is really thanks to other support that has come about, which has left to us a legacy with which we can examine these movements in Pakistan. And Nour, that's where I want you to come in and talk about how the collector is an important factor in really bringing to us what was once happening. Our national collections are pathetic in their attempts to collect, and we are losing every year what is happening in Pakistan. We still have, thanks to the early Alhambra years and the early PNCA years, and to somebody like Zubaida Agha, who actually took it upon herself to have a gallery and gave her collection to PNCA. These people left us a very small legacy. So there were other people who were enlightened enough to save for us what is rightfully belonging to the people of Pakistan. Talk a little bit about this.
Thank you. So I am based in London currently, and I was able to curate a collection that was donated to the Rangoonwala Foundation, thanks to Wahab Jaffer. And Wahab Jaffer, I'm not if many of you know, he still is an artist, a collector, and a businessman. But chronologically, it's the other way around. So I did an exhibition called Father Figure, South Asian Art Through the Eyes of Wahab Jaffer. The exhibition was three-pronged. The first was to just examine the relationship between an artist and a collector and what it means. Because in the international market now, with the rise of galleries and art fairs and God knows what else, it's become a very transactional relationship. Whereas with Wahab and with many others, that's definitely not the case. So Wahab started collecting his art in 1969 from Bori Market. And then he became very good friends with Ali Imam, who was an artist and had a gallery. And he also had art classes in his gallery. So Wahab convinced Ali Imam to put him in his art classes, and he took them for 6 months, 3 times a week. And he became an artist, and that's one of the very first works that he ever made. And as you can see, right next to that is Emmett Pervez, and Ahmed Pervez and Wahab Jaffer were very good friends. So there is a clear influence between the works. I hope everyone can see that. This is an artwork by Bashir Mirza and Wahab Jaffer. So Wahab was sitting in Bashir Mirza's studio, and Mirza was painting this beautiful artwork. And Wahab kept asking him questions and questions and questions. And then finally, Mr. Mirza said, "Why don't you come and paint with me?" And so the dark strokes are by Bashir Mirza, and then the lighter strokes have been done by Wahab Jaffer. And on the corner, I'm not sure if you can see, but Wahab has signed it once over here, and then due to excitement, he signed it on the top as well. So there are 2 signatures over here. Now, another reason that we did this exhibition, which was on at Asia House in London for 10 days and is currently on at VM Art Gallery in Karachi, is to showcase that there were not only Pakistani artists being collected, but there were also Bangladeshi and Indian artists being collected as well, because they used to come to Pakistan very frequently and vice versa as well. So Murtaza Bashir, who changed his name to Murtaja Basir in 1971, came to Pakistan, and as Samina showed, that they had first met in London with Ali Imam and the rest of the group. And this was one of the artworks that Wahab ended up buying from Ali Imam. And Murtaja Basir had shown in Rawalpindi as well, and he had shown in Lahore and Karachi, and he is currently based in Dhaka as we speak. This is an artwork by Francis Newton Souza, an artist that Zehra touched upon. He would also frequently visit Karachi and Lahore, and one of his favorite things to do was to take the train between Karachi and Lahore. And while he was on the train, he would constantly see one mosque. And that mosque, due to the train going so quickly, would be slanted slightly. So every time he depicted this mosque, it would be slanted a little bit. This is an artwork by Sadikan that both Zehra and Samina have touched upon. Another reason why the exhibition was called Father Figure was because all of these artists at the end of the day really drew upon themselves and admired each other. So this artwork over here is a portrait of Ali Imam that Sadikan had done. Wahab was visiting Sadikan in the hospital, and they ended up talking about Ali Imam, and he drew this quick sketch of him within 3 to 4 minutes, according to Wahab. And the artwork over here that you see, Bull in a Studio Mirror, was actually, it was an exchange that Wahab Jaffer did with Gulji. So this artwork was originally owned by Ismail Gulji, and he and Wahab had an exchange of Sadiq, so now the original one that Wahab had bought is currently in Gulji's home. This is an artwork by Ali Imam of Faiz Ahmed Pervez. So this, Ali Imam was a big influence for Wahab Jaffer as he started him in regards to painting. So again, the essence of father figures lies in here, as you see Wahab Jaffer with one of his father figures, Ali Imam. And it is another artwork that very much influenced Wahab while he was painting as well. And Mrs. Hashmi, would you like to say the verse?
Well, as you, Ali Imam was no portraitist, but since you're talking about father figure, I think it's interesting that the Lahore Art Circle had a very close relationship with my father, with Faiz Ahmed Pervez, who was at that time in Alhambra. And in the evenings, there used to be these very loud and vociferous conversations. We mentioned yesterday in the panel that how the links between artists and writers actually have grown, very, very weak. At one time, they were extremely strong. And so you would have these evenings in which theories would be expounded, and then people would take umbrage, and then counter theories would be discussed. So it was a very vital element in the development, I think, both of writers and of artists. And certainly Ali Imam claimed great allegiance to my father when he was in jail. And Imam also was arrested one time for being a member of the Communist Party. He used to come, he was underground, and he used to come to our house early mornings for breakfast, and my mother used to give him breakfast and so on. I think these links that the poet, in this case Faiz, had with artists was something to be noted. And in certain cases, I think the conversations between them were very important. I mean, I remember one between Sadiqain and my father. Perhaps it was, 60s, sometimes in the 60s in Karachi. I think there certain themes emerged because of these conversations.
Yeah. Okay. And this artwork is by Sayyid Haider Raza that, again, Zehra touched upon. Now, this was the brother of Ali Imam, which is not something that many people know of. During the partition of 1947, Raza ended up staying in India, where the rest of his family ended up migrating to Pakistan. Raza and Imam had they had a good relationship, but they didn't get to communicate with each other as much as they wanted to, I would say. And Raza had actually moved to Paris by 1950, and Imam would constantly be going to Europe, so that meant that he would obviously see his brother every time he would go. And this work was made specifically by Raza for his brother Imam, and there's a quote here that says, "Let the path be unknown, and you me alone," which is what Raza wrote to his brother. And then last, but very much not least, this is an artwork by Mrs. Hashmi. I believe this was one of the first exhibitions you had at Indus Gallery?
At Indus
And
Gallery.
so now that we have Mrs. Hashmi here, I'm going to let her speak about it.
What was I thinking of? I think that I've always used collage as an intrinsic part of my making work. These were difficult times, and to work on the female form, not wearing clothes, in the times of Zia-ul-Haq was making a statement in which I think that one took strength from the many women artists who discovered that they needed to work together. But certainly I think the size, because these are small works, very light in the way that they use mediums, small so that if there is a raid on the gallery, one can run away with them under your arm. And that was quite practical, as far as that is concerned. And it was really using the woman's body as a foil for the context, which the context is there in the newspaper cuttings, the context is there in the fragmentation of the way that we were trying to live our lives, an inner life which was personal, and an outer life which was under critical examination.
But from what I had spoken to Mrs. Hashmi about when I was putting this in the exhibition, if it weren't for people like Wahab Jaffer, and there's so many collectors in this room that I see right now, if it weren't for your patronage and your continued patronage, these artists wouldn't have a platform, and that is very important because it's our arts and humanity that shows us who we are at the end of the day. And we need to keep doing that, and we need to keep showing the arts. It's very important.
I think that that's a very pertinent point because it's strange, but in those years, from 77, to 88, which were extremely difficult for independent-minded artists to exist and to continue to push frontiers of art making, describing our lives as we experience them, both the inner and the outer. It was the private collector who sustained one. No government galleries would show a lot of the work that was being done. Certain forms were being supported and propagated by the state, which always happens. So I think it was certain very important roles were played by people who would show. It was almost, I found at least when I first had my show at Indus, it was almost a form of protest to buy an artist's work. When, you had the money and you didn't have the gumption or you could not protest, you would buy work which was nonconformist as a way of, showing your support, which, of course, now people try and do it through social media and other means, which we hope do not get hit in the guts by the new law that is in the offing. But I think that this sort of interesting relationships which artists and what they do have with those in the wider society who are able to be supportive, and therefore I think, like Wahab Jaffer's collection, really put together an era that has disappeared, that is no longer with us. How would we know what artists were doing from 78 to 88 if the collectors had not been supportive? I mean, for me, this is a very interesting phenomena. That was the time when people like Ali Imam played an amazing role of educating people and pointing out to them that it was a good idea to buy work. The same thing happened, we tried to do it. I remember, Ghazala, you gave us your furniture showroom to put up a show there. We had to take whatever spaces we could, and to have courageous people who would show work. So there was this parallel art making in those years. In a certain way, it still continues because there still are a lot of works which cannot be seen by the public, and one looks to collectors actually to save them. Having said that, I think we do have 10 minutes in which we can take questions. And do we have a mic? Yes.
I just wanted to know something more about the Bombay scene, what kind of support the state gives and how the artists keep their collections.
Sorry, there's now and then there's then. Museums have never really taken a huge interest when it comes to public museums. And you'll even find, well, currently in India, you almost don't want them to take an interest because it's better that they let things rot quietly than destroy them. So it is increasingly collectors who are making the difference. And in India, you don't just have one private collector who founds a museum. There are quite a few of them who do. And so it is a scene that operates very much on kind of private enterprise, but also on commercial inputs into it. Because the difference between the Bombay Progressives and the Lahore Art Circle is actually a question of money at the moment. There's a lot of money in the Progressive Artist Group, to the extent that even people who I discovered with the show were not actually part of the Progressive Artist Group, and certainly not part of the first generation of that group, very, very much want to be identified with it, for the simple reason that a few zeros are added to any sort of auction house sale that happens. So it's now a shifted context, because those works are so valuable, that there's a whole commercial scene that is very invested in it in different ways. It's also interesting that the only times, and I say this very cautiously because I'm hoping that I'm going to be doing something, but I don't know that you have public institutions or museums that are able to show work is really because you have a private gallery somewhere hiding in the background, pushing that agenda and making that show happen. And so it's a lot more, because of the money involved in it, it's a lot more complicated. And this is particularly true of modern Indian art, much less so these days, but of contemporary art. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of work, if I can use that word, going on and being brought on the market these days, which is not really genuine, which is fake.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, detrimental to the artists themselves, because people become apprehensive and they become reluctant to buy art, even if they want to do that, and if they have the means. Have the artists, the renowned artists, as a body, as a group, thought of some ways to counter that and to educate the public? Thank you.
I'd like to answer that because I'm constantly being asked to authenticate work. And unfortunately, the moderns are almost all, no longer with us. So they can't authenticate from across the Great Divide. But this is a major issue, as you've pointed out, Salman Sahab. And unfortunately, fake sadikans and alabakshis and chughtais have become an industry. And there are important people involved because there's a lot of money involved. So this is something that is very grave issue. Unfortunately, we don't have a national register in which collectors can actually get the works in their possession registered, which sometimes some people have done that. So this is a major issue, and now the auction houses have become extremely cautious about handling masters from Pakistan, who are called masters, for this reason, that they are unsure unless there's some kind of extremely watertight provenance. I mean, of course, the expertise is yet to be developed within Pakistan on, looking at color changes and so on. But it's a pertinent question, and for which really we don't have an answer.
But there's also, archival research makes a really big difference. And I mean, I'd like to make the argument that that therefore art history is important, because if you go back to the archives, there's at least some sort of ability to have an authentic relationship created for that. But I mean, it's also, isn't it an open question? I mean, we've been facing it lots and lots in India, right? Particularly with artists like Jamini Roy, who made so many works, and sometimes, at a particular period, artists weren't so fussed about authenticity. They allowed their name to be signed by lots of people. So also, how do we actually deal with that whole concept of the fake? And it's an academic question, but I think it's an interesting one.
I just want to add one thing to it. I see a lot of private collectors sitting in the audience who have really opened the doors for me when I was doing my research. So one of the suggestion is really allowing people to document the works, and maybe just putting this as a catalog out there. That is one of the ways to counter that. Because a lot of people who have these work in private collections are coming firsthand to them. So I mean, that is one way. And then, like Zehra was saying, going back to the archives, a lot of times we as art historians, what we do is we look at the painting, we're looking at in terms of dating and all of that. It just gives a lot of knowledge, when we have free access to people's collection. And of course, we are very mindful of using it with responsibility. So people who have sitting in the audience, I'm taking this platform as an opportunity. Please let us know if you have any of our modernist collection. We would love to document. And our show that Mrs. Hashmi and I curated was one other effort to do the same thing, bringing those work out in the public, documenting them. So once it's registered, so we make sure that the collector is given the credit for that. So, just a thought.
I'm going to add one last thing for this. I worked at an auction house for 5 years, and I have to say 99.9% of the works I got from Pakistan were fake. And I would constantly contact Mrs. Hashmi about this because it was a mess. And the problem is that our archive needs to be a bit better. India has a wonderful archive in that manner.
But it's also hogged by certain people. You know what I mean? And commercial, one way in which to manufacture fakes is to get hold of an archive. So this is the other problem.
There is a problem. However, we need to be better at that. But also, I also learned a lot by going into people's homes. People opened their homes, and it was great because I remember I got a work by a certain artist, and I said, wait a minute, I've seen this in someone's home. This definitely can't be the same work. So opening up your home, showing your collections, doing exhibitions, that's very important for the education of everyone.
Samina, I have a question. Where do you place Chughtai when you talk of the Lahore Art Circle? He's a person apart.
Yes.
And how do you look at him in that period? That's what I...
So Chughtai was a huge figure. Yes. And I think this whole art circle coming together was really one of the efforts to really, cut out of that path. So when Pakistan was established, Chughtai was already 51. The big name, he didn't need any other recognition at that time. So I think for these artists like Lahore Art Circle, these young ones, they really wanted to deviate from that. So when I started out the presentation, I sort of marked those themes like the modern and the national. So for these artists, forming Lahore Art Circle was a much more difficult task to break away from these traditional way of doing. I think it would have been much easier for them to get international recognition had they followed Chughtai. So I think for them to break away from that tradition was a big deal. But Chughtai was there. And then one thing I must mention is, right now what the current scene in art scene in Pakistan is very cutthroat, very unproductive in many ways. I'm very against it. There is no collective that exists in Pakistan. People don't like to discuss each other's work. They don't comment on each other's work. They don't even show their work in Pakistan very much. It's mostly going abroad. So I mean, this is debatable, so we can talk a lot about it. But what I wanted to mention is that, at this time when Lahore Art Circle is showing, they're not against Chughtai. So they're also showing works with Chughtai and Amolka and all the other people in Punjab University. There are different, places where they are having these exhibitions. But I think they were very familiar with this idea that, we need to cut out of this thing and, need to establish a new identity as a new nation. So I mean, in that sense, Chughtai was, of course, always there. But you see that, except for the copies that you see in the market, we don't see a huge following of Chughtai coming out of that So
I think we should also mention that Chughtai was not in favor of this new modernism, the rise of modernism. He was very clear that this was, inverted commas, not art. So there was an ideological difference between these two groups. I mean, Chughtai had followers, but he didn't teach. That's the interesting thing.
But
while these other artists did.
But Mrs. Hashmi, if I just may add, he was modern in his own sense.
In those times,
So-
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, we are talking a particular modernism, which is
Yeah.
dealing with abstract art, following, antecedents in Western art movements of 20th century. But, for Chughtai, painting this, I'm sure a lot of people have seen these, hostel girls.
Yes.
Or, college girls wearing these glasses, having short bob. It's so if we're talking about that, so, I mean, he's modern in a different way, but not, following. So he's very much clinging to the idea that, we need to promote this glorious past of Muslims. So, dealing with the Mughal miniature and, glorifying that. So, I mean, in that sense, but I agree with Mrs. Hashmi. He didn't favor that kind of abstract.
But vice versa. I
Yes,
think,
exactly.
No, I think that
Same way.
they did respect Chughtai, but I think they felt, okay, this is past, and we have a new way. I mean, and several times Intizar Hussain has referred to that Shakir, in his conversations with Intizar, was saying, कि हम एक कोई नई चीज़ करेंगे. So I think there was, the same thing was happening in literature. So there was a definite, and if you look at Chughtai in his connection with people who were poets and writers of his time, close links with Dr. Tasir, who was, critical to promoting Chughtai and bringing him to the notice of Allama Iqbal. So I think there were all these connections, which if we are aware of, we also feel what we need to do today.
I have a question here. I saw some of the Indian artists of that period, and their work traveled to Lahore. There is a lot of that, the deity, the
Yeah.
Hindu mythology,
Yeah.
which is being interpreted in a very modern way.
Yeah.
But it is there. Unlike in Pakistan, where it was a complete breakaway and it was very, very abstract and very, sort of commanding in its own way, because it was young in the sense that the country was young. But you see more continuity in Indian modern art of that period.
So this is really interesting, and it was really, really exciting to hear what Samina and Mrs. Hashmi was saying about Chughtai, because of course in India we have a completely different narrative about Chughtai, right?
Yes.
So he is very much put together with Abhinendranath Tagore, and into that Bengal art school circle. And so what you're saying actually feeds into that, but contests it. So someone like a Souza, who is this really angry guy, and he's also the spokesperson for the Progressive Artist Group, and he writes a lot about how much he hates the Bengal school, what he calls sentimental pictures. And all of the people put into that category were not just a Rabindranath Tagore, but also a Chughtai. And what is really interesting is when Souza is, lambasting everybody in 48 about how their job is to define the modern, and define the modern as a progressive thing, but progressive for him doesn't mean communist, because he says, that's crap in a different way. We don't want to make political art. So there is that sort of angry contestation of the past that is going on. But what is so interesting, and when I was doing archival research for the show, I discovered that actually in the late 40s and the very early 50s, just as you could say that Bengal school was, and I include Chughtai in that Bengal, at that period, were looking actually at Pahari painting.
Yes.
So was actually the early progressive artist group. So they have this tremendous rhetoric about breaking with the past, but you're right, they actually do follow it. And ironically enough, many of them, not Souza, because he wasn't taught by this guy at JJ School of Art, but Hussein had contact with Gaitonde, the second generation progressives, were actually trained by a professor, Adivasi, who his own work drew heavily from Pahari painting. And so their early work actually bears a much closer resemblance to Bengal school than you would think from the rhetoric. But what's so interesting is that they're struggling to find this modern and to claim that they're breaking with tradition. And then they come back to it in a completely different way.
I think we are out of time now, so this conversation hopefully will continue on the very nice benches and lawns that we have out there. And thank you so much for being an attentive audience.